This is part two of the lecture on least restrictive environment. We left off on the lecture, on the previous lecture, talking about inclusion and the inclusion classroom, and now we'll be talking about a resource room. A resource room is an educational placement option for students with disabilities involving specialized instruction for a specific time period during the day to address the student's needs. Most of the student's day, however, is spent in the general education classroom. So a resource room is a place where students will go for academic related issues. The bulk of their day, most of their day is spent in the general education classroom. However, if it's, say, a junior high or a high school student, one period out of the day might be a resource room period. If it's an elementary school, maybe 40 minutes or 45 minutes, the child is pulled from the classroom to go to the resource room. So resource rooms are primarily used for academically related issues. They help students with organization, they help students with reading, they help students having difficulties with academics, students with disabilities with academic concerns. But resource rooms are not effective for students with behavioral problems as the primary issue. So a student with an emotional disturbance or a student with significant behavioral concerns is probably not going to have a resource room as his or her least restrictive environment because it won't have enough specialized instruction through the period of the day. Again, most students in a resource room will have it for one period a day or for a limited period of time because the majority of the student's day is spent in the general education classroom. So far on the least restrictive environment, we have a general education classroom, we've talked about the inclusion classroom, we have a resource room, but what do we do when the child has greater needs? What do we do when the child has more needs than maybe the general education classroom with a resource room can provide? Well, when that occurs, we go to the next least restrictive education environment option, which is the special education classroom. And a special education classroom is a classroom setting under the supervision of a qualified special educator that provides specially designed instruction to meet the needs of the student with a disability. It's a special education classroom. So the majority of the day, if not the full day, is spent in a special education classroom, but it's in the general education building. So these students come to the general education building, they come to, say, the local high school, they spend their day in the local high school, but the majority of the day is spent in a special education classroom, and they're educated there. Now, this classroom is also known as a self-contained classroom. However, today we really like to refer to it more as a special education classroom. It's the more politically correct way of language in special education. So when you hear about the self-contained classrooms, you're talking about special education classrooms, but use the term special education classroom, not self-contained. Now, when we talk about these special education classrooms, you'll often see three numbers on a child's IEP reflecting the classroom. So you'll see blank with a colon, blank with a colon, and another blank, all right? And we need to fill in those blanks. So for example, if you saw in a child's IEP that the child was in a special education classroom and you saw that it was an 812, that means there can be a maximum of 8 students in the class, there's one teacher in the class, and there are 2 aides. So again, the first number represents the maximum number of students within the class. The second number represents the number of teachers in the class. And the third number represents the number of aides or support staff within the class. So if you saw a 613 special education classroom, you would know the 6 represents the maximum of 6 number of students in the class, the 1 being the number of teachers in the class, and the 3 being the 3 aides within the classroom. Now, some students can't make it in the general education building. The needs of the student are too great, and it's not appropriate for the student to be receiving the education in the general education building. The resource room isn't enough, a special education classroom is not enough. So what we have is we have special education schools. And we often have these schools for students with emotional or behavioral disorders. We have these schools for students with orthopedic or health impairments. We have these types of schools for children with autism. So various disabilities can have specific types of special ed schools. There can even be an integration of the various disabilities within the school. But a special education school is a general term applied to a separate educational placement for students with disabilities outside of a general education school. 95% of students with disabilities between the ages of 6 to 21 receive their education in a general ed building. So, although there are these special education schools, what's good to see here is that the overwhelming majority, 95% of students with disabilities, are being educated in a general education school building. But as we said, some students, because of the nature of the disability and the severity of the disability, some are so severe that they require a special education school for them to function, or for them to receive the appropriate education. Now, next on the hierarchy in terms of the least restrictive environment are the students who need a residential placement. They need to be living away from home. And as with all placement decisions, the decision whether a child requires the structure and consistency of a residential program depends on the educational needs and the appropriateness defined by the IEP. Generally, a residential program is required when the structure and consistency of a 24-hour program is necessary in order for a child to learn. So, if a child is being placed in a residential facility, that means that the child's needs are so severe and the child's needs are so high that being educated throughout the day and then coming home at the end of the day is not enough for the child. It's not appropriate, whether it's because of behavioral concerns, whether it's because of medical concerns, whether it's because of any concerns where the impact adversely affects the child's educational performance. We have educational placements known as a residential facility where the children live. There's great support staff there, whether there's a psychiatric support staff there, whether there's psychologists on staff, whether there's a medical team on staff, but it's a 24-hour residential facility. Finally, the last two educational placements are hospitalization and homebound instruction. Some children with very special needs need to be educated in a hospital setting, which is obviously a very restrictive environment. Some students may be in the hospital for great periods of time and they need to be educated within the hospital. And on the highest level of least restrictive environment in terms of being the most restrictive placement, on the continuum of placement, homebound instruction is considered the most restrictive of educational placements, because nothing can be more restrictive than a student being educated with no one. So when you think about the least restrictive environment, there's nothing more restrictive than being educated alone, a homebound instruction. Now, we're not talking about parents who decide to, educate their children at home by choice. We're not talking about parents who say homebound instruction is their way of education. We're talking about children who can't get to school, where their anxiety level is so high or their medical condition is so severe that they are at home and they cannot get to a school building. So the education comes to the child. That is considered the most severe, the most restrictive of educational placements. So when you think of the least restrictive environment, we think of it in terms of the least restrictive to the most restrictive. And now we've gone through the various educational placements, whether it's the general ed classroom, the inclusion classroom, the resource room, the special education classroom, the special education school, a residential facility, hospitalization or a hospital setting, and homebound instruction. This now ends part 2 of the lecture on the least restrictive environment. You can now go to part 3.